damn, they're really giving this shit gun a mythic. It doesn't do very well as a true LMG. It just seems very out of character for the devs to release a weapon this bad and give it a mythic. If you've been playing Call of Duty Mobile for over the past 2 years, then you definitely know about the MG42. On release, this was without doubt one of the strongest weapons in the entire game. It had very competitive time to kill at the time, top tier range, no recoil, and surprisingly fast handling for an LMG. All of this combined made for a weapon that was insufferable to fight against while being extremely brain dead. Over the seasons, it has received nerf after nerf after nerf, and with the introduction of even stronger weapons, it has been brought down to a much more reasonable state. And even then, it is still a pretty strong option in the current meta. But with the Season 4 update, we might actually have a new contender in the DP27. After all, it does have a mythic, so it has to be pretty strong, right? And if so, is it the new king of LMGs? Well, we'll be answering just that, as in this video, we'll be covering Season 4's newest kill on the block, the DP27. So let's begin by talking about the positives of this
dinner plate.
Starting off with the lethality, you'll notice that the DP27 is actually very comparable to the MG42. The DP27 features a super competitive 5-tap time to kill of 206 milliseconds up to 24 meters. For reference, the MG42 with the Krausnik 355mm rapid barrel has a time to kill of 208 milliseconds up to 15 meters. That is a difference of almost 10 meters. Beyond this range, the DP will 6-tap for a time kill of 258 milliseconds up to 31 meters, and 7-tap for a time kill of 309 milliseconds up to infinity, meaning that this gun will feature a competitive time to kill at any range. Additionally, unlike the MG42, the DP27 has a headshot multiplier that is actually useful. Within the initial damage phase of 14.4 meters, the DP can potentially achieve a 4-tap by landing a single headshot. This results in an incredibly fast time to kill of 155 milliseconds. In comparison, the MG42 requires you to land 2 headshots, which is way more unrealistic as it basically never happens. Some of you might look at the time to kill and go,
"That's sleep! The DP27's time to kill is not that special. The USS kills in 200 milliseconds up to 28 meters.
Oh, you're back. Great. It is true that the DP doesn't have the fastest time to kill, but looking at raw time to kill alone isn't exactly enough to properly analyze a weapon's lethality. Because when you actually use the DP in-game, you might actually feel that the time to kill is a lot faster. The reason for this is the fire rate. Outside of directly affecting the time to kill, a weapon's fire rate also comes in very handy when analyzing a weapon's realistic time to kill. There are 2 main metrics to look at here. The first one is obvious, the raw time to kill. This is how long it takes for a weapon to secure a kill. The issue of just looking at this value alone is that raw time to kill is an incredibly idealistic value as it assumes that you don't miss a single shot, which, unless you have aimbot, is something you'll be doing fairly often. This is where the second metric comes in, the punishment value. This refers to how much your time to kill will increase for every additional shot required. A weapon's punishment value is equal to its fire interval, so you can say that a faster fire rate results in a more forgiving weapon. So just because 2 weapons have an identical raw time to kill, that does not necessarily mean that they're equally as lethal. The faster firing weapon with a lower punishment value will have a more realistic time to kill since you aren't punished quite as hard whenever you miss. Now for the DP27's case. It slightly edges out the MG42 for having the fastest fire rate in the LMG category at 1165 rounds per minute, which equates to a low punishment value of 51.5 milliseconds. So even compared to weapons with a similar or faster raw time to kill, the DP27 still has an advantage as the moment you factor in even a single missed shot, the DP starts beating out many of these other weapons, meaning that the DP27 has a faster, realistic time to kill compared to most of the other meta weapons. Since we're done with the lethality, let's now talk about how well it fares at range. So, let's have a look at its accuracy. Its BSA is more than sufficient for most of the ranges you'll encounter in standard multiplayer. This is another advantage that the DP has over the MG42, which does struggle with BSA quite a bit. Its recoil is no slouch either. The magnitude is low and the pattern is mostly vertical with some minor horizontal sway, so you shouldn't be having that many issues in beaming at range. Now we move on to arguably the most interesting feature of this weapon, the mobility and handling. Its ADS time clocks in at 320 milliseconds. This is obviously slower than assault rifles, but for LMG standards, this is very impressive as it is only beaten out by the ones that literally play like assault rifles. And unlike the MG42, the DP has a much faster sprint to fire time at 220 milliseconds, compared to the MG's frustratingly slow 325 milliseconds. This means that the DP can react much faster than the MG42, allowing it to make better use of its impressive time to kill profile. When it comes to mobility, its sprint speed is the slowest in its class at 5.18 meters per second. This means that you will have to swap to your secondary whenever you get around the map. However, its ADS movement speed is the exact opposite, as it is absurdly fast for an LMG at 3.85 meters per second. This is not just the best in its class, this is bordering on SMG territory. This, combined with its relatively fast handling, makes the DP27 very effective in more aggressive encounters. The high strafe speed also makes it great at jiggle peeking around corners. And if you're playing S&D, you can oftentimes get away with staying aimed in the entire game, as it is not that much slower than just walking. However, the DP27 is a bit of an extreme weapon in the sense that it has very strong upsides, which are balanced out by some very strong downsides. I'm going to start by addressing the elephant in the room, or in this case the muzzle on the end of the barrel. This gun doesn't have a suppressor. Or, more accurately, this gun doesn't want you to use a suppressor. In order to achieve its impressive time to kill profile, you have to use the recoil booster. And I shouldn't have to say this, but I'll say it anyway. That is not a suppressor. Which means that every time you fire, you're getting pinged on the enemy's minimap like a UAV. This will be a deal breaker for some, as good players will be able to take advantage of this and pinpoint your location. Like searching the internet without a virtual private network. Fuck, that could have been a great sponsor segue. Anyway, this means that flanking and holding angles will be a lot harder, as you give away your position every time you fire. And since this is an LMG, you'll be doing that a lot. In addition to this, the DP27 has a pretty slow bullet speed value of 650 meters per second. This does look pretty alarming and I can already hear the butt sleeps raising their pitchforks, but please, calm down for a second. A lot of you will bring up the fact that its time to kill will worsen every 11 meters due to bullet travel time, but in most cases this is not something that you'll actually notice in game. What you'll be noticing a lot more though, is the hit registration, as the slower bullet speed will cause you to miss more. And this is a legitimate concern. If it was on any weapon that isn't the DP27. See, because the weapon fires so fast, missed shots aren't exactly a big deal, and this makes the hit reg issues a lot more tolerable. This is pretty much an accuracy in volume of fire situation. Just don't try to cross map with it. There are much better weapons for that. Magazine capacity looks pretty decent at 105 rounds, but considering that this is a lower damage weapon with an extremely fast fire rate, this means that your overall sustainability is going to be a good bit worse than true LMGs. It also doesn't help that its reload time is just as slow as these weapons. This means that you can't spray with the DP27 for quite as long, and you will find yourself getting caught on a reload fairly often. Speaking of spraying, the DP27's material penetration is lower than other LMGs. Just like the Dingo, Bruin Mark 9, MG42 and MG82, the DP can't penetrate heavy materials such as metal. Its penetration values are also lower than other LMGs, so even for the materials that you can penetrate, you'll be dealing less damage. This means that it isn't quite as effective when it comes to wallbangs. So after all that begs the question, is the DP27 a good weapon? Some will try to compare this to the MG42, but that gun serves a completely different purpose. The MG42 has similar close range time to kill and a massive 250 round belt, but it handles way slower and is not as effective at range, meaning that this is a highly defensive weapon meant for holding positions at close range. The DP27 doesn't do that. In fact, it doesn't do very well as a true LMG. It doesn't have the pre-firing capabilities and material penetration for that. The slow bullet speed also means that it's not quite as effective at the ranges you'd be taking with a true LMG. If you only treat it as such, you'd think that the DP27 is terrible. This is the #1 mistake that you can make with the weapon. Even I made this mistake. I initially thought, damn, they're really giving this shit gun a mythic. But after a while of using it, I soon understood what this gun was meant for. The best way to describe the DP27 would be to quote Jonathan Ferguson. The DP27 is a
super assault rifle. It's just an assault rifle with more bullets.
This is clearly an LMG that encourages a more aggressive playstyle. It features an amazing time to kill profile, along with mobility and handling that is closer to assault rifles rather than LMGs, heavily rewarding you for playing within flex engagements. The slow bullet speed discourages you from taking long-range fights, but given the low recoil, competitive BSA and super forgiving fire rate, it is not completely defenseless at range either. Even the lack of a suppressor encourages you to get in the enemy's face as they would know where you're at anyway. Now, this archetype of weapon is not new. There are other LMGs that try to fill a similar role, but none of them do it quite as effectively as the DP. The UL features impressive range and 3-tap time to kill, but this gun is better suited for mid to long range playstyles, as its time to kill is heavily reliant on upper body shots, making it less consistent than the DP's, which is guaranteed and not even that much slower. Also, the UL's fire rate is pretty punishing compared to the DP. The whole girl lacks in time to kill and mag size. The Hades has really good 3-tap potential and handling but suffers from mediocre range and BSA. The Dingo has the best ammo capacity out of all the pseudo assault rifles, but its time to kill is slower than the DP and its recoil is just way off. The Bruin is pretty much just a Dingo with less recoil at the cost of less ammo, but it still falls behind the DP in time to kill. So overall, the DP27 is the best pseudo assault rifle. If you are an AR player who doesn't mind sacrificing a bit of mobility and handling for a larger mag size, while still having excellent lethality and enough accuracy for range, this is an amazing option that is not only very strong, but also incredibly well balanced. I actually think the devs cooked with this one in terms of balancing, which is not something that you see every day. Building the DP27 is pretty simple. Start with the recoil booster. This is the mandatory attachment as it improves the weapon's fire rate, giving us the previously mentioned time to kill profile. Empress 490mm rapid barrel for range, mobility and handling. Zac S3 tac stock for ADS movement speed, disable for the slow and hit, and the 7.62x54mm 105 round pans for the largest mag size. The 30-06 81 round pans do look quite tempting as it helps your range and bullet speed. It even increases the chest and upper arm multipliers from 1x to 1.1x, but these are ultimately not worth it. The main reason for this is because it penalizes your fire rate by quite a bit, which by extension makes your time to kill slower. You go from MG42 time to kill to Grau 556 time to kill, which is a pretty substantial increase. The improved multipliers can be useful in compensating for this, but this is not very consistent since the lower arms, which have not been affected mind you, will block these areas. So you'll usually end up with the slower time to kill. Now if one day the devs randomly decided to make this attachment boost the lower arms as well, then this will be bloody amazing and would make it the better option. But as it stands right now, the base ammo type is overall better. If you don't like the base iron sights and don't have the mythic, you can replace the perk with an optic of preference for better visibility. Alternatively, you can either use the Mark 6 Para foregrip for faster ADS time, which is what I prefer, or sleight of hand for faster reload speed. And that covers everything there is to know about the DP27. When this gun first dropped, it wasn't very good. In fact, I was somewhat baffled on how they were balancing this gun. It just seems very out of character for the devs to release a weapon this bad and give it a mythic. But fortunately, they gave it a pretty decent buff through a hotfix, and I've been finding it to be a very strong and fun weapon to use. But that's just my experience from using the weapon, so what do you guys think about the DP27? Do you think it's overpowered, underpowered, or perfectly balanced? Be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you found the video helpful, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe. But until then, I'll be seeing you in the next one. Bye bye.